To get us started, we're going to look at the Cart Creek fire that occurred nearly 30 years ago in northern Utah on the Ashley National Forest. This scenario is similar to many recent fires in that the firefighters found themselves on an escape route that proved to be ineffective or too far from the safety zone given the unexpected and drastic change in fire behavior that actually occurred. As we look at this scenario and throughout the rest of this training, keep in mind that most entrapments and burnovers are directly related to the difference between your expected fire behavior and the actual fire behavior. Virtually all fireground decisions are based on your expectations of what that fire is going to do. It is incumbent on all firefighters, regardless of our experience level, to continuously improve our ability to predict fire behavior given the conditions we observe. Let's go to Utah and take a look at the Cart Creek fire. At 12 o'clock noon on July 16, 1977, a lightning fire started just south of the confluence of Cart Creek and Spruce Creek on the Ashley National Forest. The fire was burning in extremely flashy fuels, mainly grass and sagebrush, with scattered junipers, ponderosa pines, and clumps of bitterbrush. The elevation at the top of the bluffs to the west is 6,700 feet and 6,000 feet at the creek junction, which is about 1/2 mile away. The weather forecast for the day called for partly cloudy skies with scattered afternoon showers and thunderstorms. Winds light and variable out of the southeast, driven by topography, with considerable gustiness in the late afternoon. High temperatures were forecasted at 90 to 95 degrees in the valley bottoms and 80 to 85 degrees on the ridge tops. Minimum relative humidity 15 to 20%. At 12:10, the district FMO was on scene, estimated the fire at less than 1 acre, and ordered a heli-attack crew to respond. The local helicopter had just returned from a previous assignment, and many of the crew members were still en route, driving back to station. Only 2 available personnel were loaded and delivered to H1 about 12:35. The helicopter then picked up the district FMO and 1 other firefighter and delivered them to H1, where they met the first 2 heli-attack crew members. The FMO ordered a retardant drop and 20 additional firefighters. The fire was spreading slowly uphill against the ground winds to the northwest and more rapidly with the wind downhill and west towards Cart Creek Canyon. 1 person was left to manage the helispot and the other 3 walked to the fire and began an unanchored line uphill to the south. Other district personnel were attending a local rodeo when the call came in. They were to report to Cedar Springs Lagoon about 1 mile north of the fire and would be picked up by helicopter. At 1300, 2 more firefighters arrived on scene and joined Squad 1. The strategy was to continue line construction south uphill and then swing west to cut off the fire before it reached the ridgetop. They were working close to the fire and could knock it down quite easily. Meanwhile, the fire continued to move easterly downhill, causing them to relocate what was H1 to H2. At 1340, 2 more firefighters arrived by helicopter. While circling the area, they recognized the desirability of cutting off the fire at the ridgetop, and they unloaded on the ridge. They made contact with the FMO and then started cutting a second unanchored section of line along the ridgetop toward the squad below. The FMO sent 2 members of his squad up to help the squad on the ridge. The helicopter unloaded 3 more firefighters on H2 and they began walking towards Squad 1. When they arrived, the FMO sent them to join in with Squad 2, but 2 members were called back when the fire became more than Squad 1 could handle. There was now 4 members on Squad 2 plus the squad leader, and 4 members in Squad 1 plus the FMO, who was also the IC. The helicopter delivered more firefighters to H2. Another squad of 4 people, Squad 3, was formed and instructed to proceed from H2 to a point east of the initial attack point. They began a 3rd segment of unanchored line. The fire by this time had burned east and outflanked Squad 1's line. Squad 3 was trying to cut off that segment of fire and tie it back into Squad 1's fire line. As the fire approached H2, the pilot requested another helispot further east away from the fire's edge. A 4th squad was delivered to H3, and were instructed to begin at the low end of Squad 3's line and build line downhill to the north. Squad 4 started walking to the fire.
And I remember when we flew in, we flew basically over the fire down in this drainage here. And our thought at that time was, wow, this is just a little fire, very little fire activity. It was just kind of creeping on the edges. And our first thought was, man, we'll have this out and be back to the rodeo in Manila tonight. Dave proceeded to line us out and said basically that we're going to hike up across the edge of the fire here, up over to where they'd started building line up above. And so we had no problem with that. And we could see the fire just below us. And at that time it was probably 10 acres, maybe a little bit more. But the flame length was minimal, a foot and a half flame lengths. And so we were, I guess, what I'd call complacent. And so we were lined out to hike up to where we were going to tie into the other line. And so we proceeded to hike across the toe of this steeper slope right here over to where we were told that the other crew had built line. And at that time, we weren't even thinking about the fire basically, because there was just so minimal fire activity. So we proceeded to hike up through there. And as we were hiking, Gene Campbell was ahead of me, and then myself, and then Annette Rogers, and then Dave Knoll. And I remember Gene just ahead of me, he said, "Damn it, somebody left a Pulaski leaning against a cedar tree down there." And he says, "I better go in and get it." And that was towards the edge of the fire. And Dave said, "You guys go ahead and I'll wait for Gene to go get that, and then we'll come up behind you." And so we proceeded to hike on up there, and Dave and Gene stayed behind.
We need to remember that in 1977, fire shelters were an optional piece of equipment. All the firefighters on this fire had fire shirts and hard hats, but Nomex pants and fire shelters were not provided. Let's get into our groups and complete the first exercise in your student workbook. Now let's go back to the Cart Creek incident and see what actually happened. At 1450, the helicopter foreman radioed to the ground that fire activity was intensifying abruptly along the entire fire perimeter. Squad 3 noted that while building a total of 63 feet of line, they had to back off twice due to fire intensity. Squad 2 had completed 167 feet of line and were preparing to drop off the ridge and tie into Squad 1's line only 150 feet away. The FMO and squad leader met near a rocky bluff below Squad 2 and felt they could successfully tie off their lines and cut off the head of the fire. Suddenly, the fire behavior changed dramatically, and the leader of Squad 2, who was in voice contact but below the rest of the squad, ordered them off the ridge. He realized at this time that this was more than just a simple increase in intensity due to fuel change, but that the fire had changed behavior drastically and was moving toward them at a very rapid rate. Word was passed to drop tools. The squad did so in an orderly fashion and ran towards an opening in the fire created by Squad 1's line and into the black along with Squad 1. The last crew member in line did not come through behind the others, and when they called to him, they got no response. The helicopter overhead observed the last crew member running a few yards behind the crew when a juniper suddenly flared up. The crew member stopped, paused momentarily, turned around, and began to run back to the ridge. The helicopter dropped low over him and tried to get his attention to turn around and follow the crew into the black. However, as the crew member struggled uphill and upslope, he seemed disoriented and was stumbling and falling among the rocks. The fire then rolled over his location. The helicopter pilot, realizing he could no longer help the firefighter, swung to the other end of the fire to see what was happening there. He observed that the fire had erupted along the entire line almost instantaneously. Squad 3 had moved into the black, and Squad 4 was just arriving to the edge of the fire. The leader yelled for his squad to move rapidly through a hole below Squad 3's line and into the black. All but the last 2 crew members in line made it. When the squad looked back after the fire erupted, they could not see their fellow crew members, only a wall of flame and smoke 10 to 30 feet high. The crew members were last seen just 15 to 20 yards behind the rest of the crew.
That the fire blew up, and I do not remember any flames or whatever. All I remember is smoke. And the smoke was such that I could not see the person in front of me. And the YCC girl behind me, I'd already previously told her, because I had worked with the YCC kids before, and they didn't know quite what fires were like or anything. I said, you just stay right behind me, follow me wherever I go. And she did just that. But when it did blow up, all I could see was smoke, and we'd gone ahead, and Dave and Jean were back behind us, and not a minute, maybe a little bit more than a minute. That was all, the only difference. And as we hiked up there and it blew up, I heard Ray Rubel yell, "Run for the burned area." And at that time I was contemplating whether I should run away from the fire or if I should run towards the fire and try to get around the edge where we thought there was a fire line and into the burned area. And when Ray Rubel yelled that turned my attention back to the fire, and I looked through there, and it was just like a tunnel through the smoke. And I took off and ran through that with this YCC girl right behind me.
The subsequent investigation revealed that the 2 members of Squad 4 were cut off from their escape route and ran south about 50 yards into a stony ridge in an attempt to outrun the fire. They then turned northeast towards the helispot. The helicopter, now flying over this section of line, observed the 2 crew members running back towards the helispot. One moved about 20 yards and the other 35 yards before the helicopter foreman noticed a pine tree flaring up near where they were running. He observed both men fall at the same time. One did not move, and the other struggled to get up, open his canteen, and pour water over himself before the fire rolled over him.
A few lessons learned from this as we brought different groups in here on staff rides. Most of the FMOs or the leaders asked the group, what would you have done different? And you know, there's a lot of things we violated right here. The first thing in coming in, we landed, our helispot was above the fire, and as we grouped right there, the only briefing that we had was, well, we're going to hike across here and across this flat and tie in with a line that Shakely's crew has already been building up there. And we were very complacent because the fuels were fine fuels, and the flame length were a foot and a half. And so we thought, well, let's just head right up there and tie in with the line, rather than trying to find an anchor point back to the east and down where we could have anchored it off into Spruce Creek and worked our way up. And then our safety routes and safe zones, again, we were so far away from the fire edge that there was unburned fuel between us and the fire again, and we didn't really have a clear escape route. And again, we should have been building line direct, flanking it, and keeping one foot in the black as we went, but we didn't do it. And then communication, we really didn't have good communications with the other squad on the fire, at least from the squad's perspective. And so we wasn't aware of what was happening on the fire at all times. But I guess the main thing that overwhelmed me was the quickness that everything happened. it didn't give us time to react. It was a complacent situation where we thought, no problem, we can build line around this and be through with it. But the fuels were so dry and the wind came up so sudden that the whole hillside, rather than being a continuous burn, it was like it flashed across the hillside. And there wasn't time to do anything. I feel even if we would have had fire shelters at that time, there wouldn't have been time to get in them. It just happened that quick. And I guess in hindsight, I would never walk across in front of a fire uphill from it and find fuels like this. I guess one thing it's taught me when I've been on other fires and have been a crew boss or IC type 3 or whatever, I want to know where my people are and what they're doing at all times and make sure that they know their escape routes, know what the hazards are, and know what the plan of attack is, and make sure we have a good anchor point and we're working off of that, and just be cognizant of what's happening with the fire at all times, no matter how complacent it may be. I feel that's the one benefit that came out of this for me, is down the road in my career it has helped me to be very conscious of what's happening with the fire at all times and where everybody is and what the escape routes are.
Setting aside the tactical aspects of the Cart Creek fire, the dramatic change in fire behavior is worth further investigation. In your student workbook, you'll find the section from the Cart Creek Fire Investigation Report regarding fire behavior. Please read this information and then complete the next exercise in your student workbook. The Cart Creek incident was one of several incidents between 1976 and 1979 that led to the issuance of fire-resistant clothing and the requirement for all firefighters to carry a fire shelter. But the lessons learned from this incident go far beyond that. We continue to run into trouble when our predicted fire behavior doesn't match up with the actual fire behavior. This last season, 65 firefighters on 22 different incidents were either entrapped or burned over. During these incidents, 19 fire shelters were deployed, and they resulted in 7 of the 24 fatalities we suffered. Minimizing the difference between predicted fire behavior and what actually occurs is everyone's responsibility. And the only way to do this is by being diligent students of fire and constantly evaluating our predictive abilities given the conditions we're faced with. Experience can be excellent training, but only if we look at every scenario as a potential training opportunity and continuously fine-tune our fire behavior prediction skills. Additional information on the Cart Creek fire can now be found on the leadership website in the Staff Ride Library.